In the hushed hours just before dawn on a frigid December morning in the year 2017, Arden Vale stumbled over a rusted shotgun shell near the edge of Blackwater Creek, and with it, unearthed a secret that would shatter the trust her entire town had placed in the man sworn to protect them. She wasn't looking for trouble. She was only searching for her missing dog, a scrappy terrier named Whiskey who'd vanished 2 nights prior after a storm rolled through Mill Hollow, Kentucky, snapping power lines and scattering rumors like dry leaves in a gale. But what Arden found buried beneath half-frozen mud and brittle reeds wasn't Whiskey. It was a blood-stained deputy's badge, and Sheriff Elias Crow's fingerprint on the lie that had kept the town quiet for far too long. Mill Hollow wasn't the kind of place that made headlines. Nestled in the crook of Harlan County's coal-dusted hills, it clung to the past like ivy to old brick, proud, stubborn, and suspicious of outsiders. Everyone knew everyone, or so they thought. Sheriff Crow had worn his star for nearly 2 decades, his gravelly voice and broad shoulders a familiar comfort at school events, town hall meetings, and the annual Riverbend Corn Festival. Children waved when his cruiser rolled by. Elders called him son. He'd even helped Arden's grandmother fix her porch railing the summer before she passed. That was the problem though. Trust, once given in places like Mill Hollow, hardened like concrete. Nearly impossible to crack even when it began to rot from within. Arden, at 29, had never been one to toe the line. She'd left Mill Hollow at 18 with a duffel bag and a bus ticket to Nashville, chasing music and meaning. A decade later she'd returned not with fame but with grief. Her mother's sudden passing had forced her back into the only home she'd ever truly known, now echoing with silence and unanswered questions. She'd taken over the family's shuttered antique shop, Veil and Vine, slowly breathing life into dusty furniture and forgotten heirlooms. Quiet, observant, and far more perceptive than most gave her credit for, Arden noticed things others ignored. The way Deputy Langley's eyes flickered when Crow's name was mentioned, the sudden disappearance of local hunter Boyd Reeves after he'd filed a missing persons report for his brother, and the odd number of unmarked vehicles parked near the old limestone quarry after midnight. The morning she found the badge, the air bit with the kind of cold that seeped into bone. Fog hung low over the creek, muffling the world into a ghostly hush. Arden's breath came in quick, white plumes as she knelt, her gloved fingers brushing mud from the tarnished metal. It bore the number 17, Boyd Reeves' badge. Her stomach dropped. Boyd hadn't just vanished. He'd been silenced. And the sheriff? He'd filed the official report labeling Boyd's absence as voluntary departure due to personal distress. But Arden knew Boyd. He'd been renovating his mother's kitchen. He'd promised to help her fix her shop's leaky roof. He wouldn't just leave. That night, Arden dug deeper. Not with grand gestures, but with careful whispers and borrowed records. She visited Marla Finch, the retired court clerk who lived in a crooked house full of cats and yellowed newspapers. Marla, her voice trembling like dry leaves, handed Arden a folder marked Property Seizures, Confidential. Inside were deeds, all dated within the past 18 months, all signed under duress or forged entirely, all leading back to a shell corporation, Crow Holdings LLC. The properties? Formerly owned by people who'd either moved away suddenly or died under unclear circumstances. One name stood out, Lenore Pike. A 73-year-old widow who'd refused to sell her 80 acres of timberland, land that, as it turned out, sat directly atop a newly discovered natural gas vein. Lenore had been found in her kitchen 3 weeks after publicly refusing the sheriff's generous offer to buy her out. The coroner ruled it a stroke. But Arden remembered Lenore's hands, steady as stone even at her age. And she remembered the sheriff showing up at the funeral in crisp dress blues, placing a folded flag on the casket like he had the right. Arden's pulse hammered in her throat as she cross-referenced dates and names. Every disappearance, every suspicious death, every coerced sale, it traced back to Crow. And every time, the sheriff's office closed the file quickly, quietly, with minimal investigation. The realization didn't crash over her like a wave. It seeped in slowly, cold and heavy, like creek water rising after a storm. She knew going to the state police was risky. Crow had friends in Frankfurt. But she also knew she couldn't stay silent. Not when Whiskey's collar turned up a week later, tossed onto her porch with a note that read, "Stop digging, or you'll vanish too." The handwriting was neat, deliberate, familiar. She'd seen it on community event flyers signed E. Crow. Arden didn't flinch. Instead, she copied every document, uploaded encrypted backups to 3 cloud drives, and mailed a sealed envelope to a journalist in Louisville, a woman known for taking down corrupt officials in Appalachia. Then she waited. The town buzzed with uneasy energy. Crow's patrols grew more frequent, his eyes lingering too long on her shop window. At the diner, conversations died when she entered. Even old Mrs. Gable, who usually slipped her an extra biscuit, looked away. Then, on the evening of January 17th, everything unraveled. State troopers descended on Mill Hollow just after dusk, their blue lights slicing through the winter gloom. Crow was arrested at his home, still in his bathrobe, muttering about misunderstandings and meddling outsiders. The evidence was overwhelming. Falsified records, hidden bank accounts, forensic matches linking him to Boyd Reeves' abandoned truck. And most damning of all, security footage from a gas station 20 miles away showing Crow dumping items that matched Whiskey's collar and Lenore Pike's missing silver locket. The town didn't erupt in outrage. It fell into a stunned, ashamed silence. Trust, once broken in a place like Mill Hollow, doesn't just crack, it collapses. People avoided each other's eyes. The for sale signs on Crow Holdings properties now seemed like tombstones for a faith they'd all misplaced. Arden stood on her porch days later, whiskey curled at her feet, restored and wagging. Snow dusted the hills like powdered sugar, softening the harsh lines of winter. She watched as Sheriff Crow's cruiser, now stripped of its insignia, was towed away. There was no triumph in her chest, only a weary kind of clarity. Authority wears many masks, and sometimes the most dangerous lies come from the mouths we've taught ourselves to trust without question. Mill Hollow would heal slowly, but it would never be the same. And Arden? She kept digging, not for trouble but for truth. Because now she knew, in the quiet corners of America where loyalty runs deep and secrets run deeper, the first rule of survival isn't to obey, it's to look closer. Always look closer. Weeks passed, and the chill in Mill Hollow deepened, not just from the winter, but from the quiet reckoning that followed Sheriff Crow's arrest. No one spoke his name aloud anymore. It hung in the air like smoke after a fire, bitter and unwanted. The state appointed an interim sheriff, a no-nonsense woman from Lexington named Miriam Colby, who arrived with a clipboard, a calm demeanor, and eyes that missed nothing. She didn't make speeches. She simply opened the old case files Arden had flagged, dusted them off, and began re-interviewing witnesses without fanfare. That, more than anything, restored a fragile sense of hope. Arden kept her shop open longer hours, not just to sell vintage quilts and oak writing desks, but because people started coming, not to buy but to talk. They'd linger by the pot-bellied stove, warming their hands, their voices low. Mrs. Gable finally admitted she'd seen Crow's cruiser idling near Lenore Pike's house the night before she died. Old Man Teague confessed he'd been pressured into signing over his hunting cabin after Crow threatened to revisit a decades-old poaching charge. Each confession was a small stitch in the town's torn fabric, slow but necessary. One rainy afternoon in late February, a battered pickup truck rolled into town, its paint peeling and one headlight flickering. Out stepped Boyd Reeves, alive, thinner, with a jagged scar running from his temple to his jaw. He'd been hiding in a cousin's root cellar in West Virginia, too scared to come back after Crow's men had beaten him senseless and left him for dead near the quarry. When he heard about the arrest on a crackling radio broadcast, he knew it was safe to return. Arden nearly dropped the stack of porcelain plates she was unpacking when she saw him standing in her doorway, hat in hand, eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and relief. The town gathered that evening, not for a festival or a funeral, but for something new. A listening circle, held in the old community hall with folding chairs and coffee brewed strong. Boyd spoke first, his voice rough but steady. He described how Crow had tried to force him to falsify evidence against a rival landowner, how he'd refused, and how the next thing he knew, he was waking up in the woods with broken ribs and no phone. Others followed, Lenore's granddaughter, a quiet librarian named Tamsin, shared letters her grandmother had written expressing fear of official harassment. Even Deputy Langley, pale and shaking, admitted Crow had made him destroy evidence and run fake background checks on anyone who asked too many questions. No one shouted. No one blamed each other. There was only the soft hum of rain on the roof and the occasional sniffle. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was truth. And in a town that had traded truth for peace for too long, that felt like a beginning, Arden began documenting everything. Not for gossip, but for history. She typed late into the night, compiling names, dates, and testimonies into a clean, factual record she titled the Mill Hollow Accountability Archive. She mailed copies to the Kentucky Attorney General's office, the local historical society, and the Appalachian Citizens Law Center. She didn't seek credit. She just wanted to make sure the story couldn't be buried again. Spring arrived tentatively, with crocuses pushing through thawing soil and the creek swelling with snowmelt. Whiskey chased rabbits through the tall grass behind the shop, his bark sharp and joyful. Arden planted a dogwood tree in front of Vale and Vine, a living memorial to Lenore Pike, whose land was finally returned to her family. Tamsin came by often, helping organize the archive, her quiet strength a perfect counterpoint to Arden's restless energy. Then in early May, the state brought formal charges against Elias Crow: racketeering, conspiracy, evidence tampering, unlawful seizure of property, and 2 counts of attempted murder. Boyd Reeves and a young environmental surveyor who'd stumbled upon illegal drilling near the quarry. The trial was set for late summer in Frankfurt. Arden knew she'd have to testify. The thought made her palms sweat, but she also knew silence was no longer an option. Meanwhile, life in Mill Hollow began to shift in subtle, hopeful ways. The town council voted unanimously to create a civilian oversight committee for the sheriff's department. A local nonprofit started offering free legal aid for landowners. And for the first time in years, the Riverbend Corn Festival was planned not by the sheriff's office, but by a coalition of residents, including Arden, Boyd, and even Miriam Colby, who surprised everyone by entering her famous peach cobbler in the bake-off. Still, shadows lingered. Some families who'd benefited quietly from Crow's schemes packed up and left without saying goodbye. Others stayed but kept to themselves, their shame a silent weight. Arden understood. Healing wasn't linear. Trust, once shattered, couldn't be glued back together overnight. It had to be rebuilt, brick by careful brick. One warm evening in June, Arden sat on her porch swing, sipping sweet tea as fireflies blinked in the gathering dusk. Whiskey lay at her feet, snoring softly. Down the road, she could hear children laughing near the creek, the same creek where it all began. She thought about how close she'd come to never looking down that day. How easy it would have been to assume Whiskey had just wandered off, to accept the official story, to go back to varnishing old dressers and pretending the rot beneath the surface didn't exist. But she hadn't. And because of that, Boyd was home. Lenore's land was safe. And Mill Hollow, scarred but alive, was learning to breathe again. A car slowed at the end of her drive. It wasn't a cruiser, just a faded sedan with out-of-state plates. A woman stepped out, mid-40s, sharp-eyed, carrying a leather satchel. She introduced herself as Clara Madsen, the journalist Arden had contacted months ago. She'd come not just to cover the trial, but to write a full feature on what happens after the headlines fade, on the quiet courage of ordinary people who refuse to look away. Arden offered her a glass of tea. They talked long into the night, not just about Crow but about accountability, memory, and the strange resilience of small towns. Clara left before dawn, but not before handing Arden a business card. "If you ever want to tell this story beyond Mill Hollow," she said, "call me." Arden tucked the card into her journal, beside a pressed dogwood blossom. She didn't know if she'd ever leave again. But she knew this much: she wouldn't stay silent. Not ever again. Because in America, especially in its quiet corners, the most dangerous person isn't the criminal in the shadows. It's the one wearing the badge who convinces everyone the shadows aren't there at all. And the most powerful act? Simply turning on the light. By mid-July, the heat settled over Mill Hollow like a damp blanket, thick and unrelenting. Cicadas buzzed in the oaks, and the creek slowed to a lazy trickle. Arden kept her shop windows open in the evenings, letting the warm breeze carry the scent of honeysuckle and wet earth inside. But beneath the stillness, tension hummed. The trial was less than a month away, and though Crow sat in a county jail 50 miles north, his presence still haunted the town, not as a man but as a warning. A reminder of how easily power can twist into something unrecognizable. Arden received her subpoena on a Tuesday. The paper felt heavier than it should have. She read it 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it inside the drawer of her grandmother's old writing desk. The one with the secret compartment where, as a child, she'd hidden her diary. Now she used it for things that mattered: the archive, Boyd's sworn statement, and a faded photograph of Lenore Pike standing proudly beside her Timberland, arms crossed, chin high. She wasn't afraid, not exactly. But she was tired. Tired of the sideways glances from neighbors who still weren't sure whose side she was on. Tired of waking up at 3 a.m., heart racing, convinced she'd heard tires crunching on her gravel drive. Tired of feeling like truth was a burden only she was willing to carry. Then one sweltering afternoon a letter arrived, not by email or courier but hand-delivered. No return address. Just her name, written in looping cursive on thick, cream-colored paper. She opened it with caution, half expecting another threat. Instead, it was a note from Elias Crow himself. "I never meant for it to go this far," it began. "I only wanted to protect this town. You wouldn't understand. You left. You came back playing hero with your city notions and your outsider eyes. But Mill Hollow survives because of order, not because of truth. Truth gets people killed. Ask your mother." Arden's breath caught. Her mother's death had been ruled a cardiac event. Sudden, tragic, but natural. She'd always accepted it. But now, the words coiled in her chest like a snake. Had Crow known something? Was it a taunt? Or a confession wrapped in guilt? She didn't show the letter to anyone. Not yet. Instead, she dug out her mother's medical file from the county health department. A process that took 2 days and a carefully worded request citing next of kin rights. The report was thorough, but something nagged at her. A notation in the margin, barely legible: toxicology delayed, specimens missing. She called the lab in Hazard. They had no record of ever receiving the samples. The chain of custody had vanished. That night, she drove to Frankfurt and met with Clara Madsen in a dimly lit diner off the interstate. Over black coffee and pie that tasted faintly of cinnamon and regret, Arden laid it all out. The letter, the missing toxicology, the way her mother had seemed anxious in the weeks before she died, muttering about land meetings and pressure from the office. Clara's expression darkened. If your mother was looking into the property seizures, and she died right after, that's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. The next morning, Arden filed a formal motion with the court to reopen her mother's case as a potential homicide. It was a long shot, but it sent a message. She wasn't just a witness anymore. She was a daughter demanding answers. The town reacted in quiet waves. Some whispered she was chasing ghosts. Others, like Tamsin, Boyd, and even old Mrs. Gable, showed up at her shop with casseroles, books, or just silent company. Miriam Colby assigned a rotating patrol to drive past Arden's house twice a night. "Not because I think you're in danger," she said firmly, "but because everyone deserves to sleep." August arrived with thunderstorms that rolled in like drums. The trial began on the 12th, in a courtroom so air-conditioned it felt like winter. Arden sat in the third row, whiskey curled under her chair. Technically not allowed, but the bailiff had winked and said, "Everyone needs a little comfort these days." Crow looked smaller in person. His once imposing frame had shrunk beneath a cheap suit. His hair was grayer, his hands trembling slightly when he raised them to adjust his glasses. But his eyes, cold, calculating, still held the same authority he'd wielded for years. When the prosecutor played the gas station footage, Crow didn't flinch. When Boyd described the beating, Crow stared straight ahead, jaw tight. But when Arden took the stand, something shifted. She spoke clearly without theatrics. She described finding the badge, the blood, the forged deeds. She recounted the note on her porch, the missing toxicology, the letter from jail. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She simply told what happened, one fact at a time, like stacking stones to build a wall. On cross-examination, Crow's lawyer tried to paint her as a disgruntled outsider with a grudge. You left Mill Hollow, didn't you? Chased fame in Nashville. Came back only after your mother died. Isn't it possible you're projecting your grief onto Sheriff Crow? Arden met his gaze evenly. I left because I wanted more. I came back because I loved my home. And I'm here now because loving a place means refusing to let it rot in silence. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On the 4th morning they returned with a verdict, guilty on all counts. The courtroom exhaled as one. Crow didn't react. He simply stood, smoothed his lapels, and allowed the bailiffs to lead him away without a word. Outside, reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed. But Arden slipped away through a side door, Clara at her side. They drove back to Mill Hollow in silence, the highway stretching empty before them. The town didn't celebrate. There were no fireworks, no victory parade. Instead, that evening, people gathered at the community hall again, this time not to confess but to plan. They formed a land trust to protect vulnerable properties. They launched a youth mentorship program to teach civic engagement. And they voted, unanimously, to rename the stretch of Blackwater Creek near the quarry Lenore's Reach. Arden stood at the edge of the water one last time that season, the sun low and golden on the ripples. Whiskey splashed in the shallows, chasing minnows. She thought of her mother, of Lenore, of Boyd's scar, of the quiet courage it took to speak when everyone else stayed silent. She knew Crow would appeal. Knew the scars would linger. But something fundamental had changed, not just in Mill Hollow but in her. She wasn't just a daughter or a shopkeeper or a reluctant truth-teller. She was a keeper of the story. And stories, when told honestly, have a way of outliving lies. That fall she began writing a book, not for fame but for memory. She called it Don't Trust the Sheriff, not as a warning but as a lesson. Because in America, trust must be earned, not inherited with a badge, a title, or a uniform. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is question the hand that's supposed to protect you. As the first frost kissed the hills in October, Arden placed a copy of the manuscript in the hollow of the dogwood tree, alongside a smooth river stone and a photo of her mother smiling in the garden. Let the earth hold it, she thought. Let the truth take root. And somewhere deep in the woods, the wind carried the sound of a creek running clean again. Winter returned to Mill Hollow not with the same dread as before, but with a quiet kind of resolve. Snow fell gently in early December, blanketing the hills in soft white, muffling the past beneath a fresh layer of stillness. Arden watched it from her shop window, a mug of spiced cider warming her hands. Vale and Vine had become more than a store, it had become a heartbeat. Locals stopped by not just to browse mismatched china or hand-stitched quilts, but to share news, to plan, to remember. The sign above the door no longer read just antiques. Beneath it, someone, Tamsin likely, had painted in careful script, and truth. The book manuscript sat with a small press in Asheville, North Carolina. Arden had turned down offers from New York publishers who wanted to sensationalize it, to turn Crow into a cartoon villain and her into a folk hero. She refused. This wasn't entertainment. It was testimony. The Asheville press understood. They promised clean prose, factual integrity, and proceeds split between the Mill Hollow Land Trust and a legal fund for rural whistleblowers. Boyd Reeves reopened his auto shop, this time with a community co-op model. Half the profits went toward fixing cars for elderly residents who couldn't afford repairs. He also started teaching mechanics to teenagers on Saturday mornings. Gotta give him something real to hold on to, he told Arden one afternoon, wiping grease from his brow. Not just stories, skills. Tamsin, meanwhile, launched a local history project called Voices of Hollow Creek, recording oral histories from elders who remembered Mill Hollow before the coal boom, before the silence, before fear became policy. Her first interviewee was 92-year-old Eunice Bellwether, who recalled a time when the sheriff was chosen not by election, but by town consensus, and removed just as easily if he failed the people. Miriam Colby stayed on as sheriff. Not interim anymore, elected by a landslide in November. She wore her badge, but she also held monthly open forums at the diner, where citizens could ask anything, about patrols, budgets, even her coffee order. Trust, she said, wasn't built in grand gestures but in consistency. In showing up. And show up she did. Even on nights when a frozen pipe burst at the community center or when a lost hiker needed rescue off Pine Ridge Trail. She never acted like she was above the mud. That, more than anything, healed the wound Crow had left behind. Arden kept testifying, not in courtrooms but in living rooms, school gyms, and church basements across eastern Kentucky. She spoke about land rights, about governmental accountability, about the quiet violence of corruption that wears a friendly face. She never called herself an activist. "I'm just someone who looked down when others looked away," she'd say. One evening in February, she received a call from Clara Matson. The story had sparked something bigger. Similar patterns were emerging in 3 other Appalachian counties. Sheriffs leveraging property laws, pressuring vulnerable landowners, silencing dissent under the guise of maintaining order. Clara was forming a regional watchdog coalition. Would Arden join? She hesitated. Mill Hollow still needed her. But then she thought of Lenore Pike, of her mother, of Boyd bleeding in the woods. This wasn't just about one town. It was about a system that thrived in isolation, counting on people to stay quiet, to mind their own business, to trust the badge more than their own eyes. "Yes," she said. "But on one condition. We train locals to lead, not outsiders to save them." Clara laughed, a warm, relieved sound. "That's exactly the point." Spring came earlier that year. By March, daffodils pushed through the thawing earth, and the creek roared with meltwater. Arden organized the first accountability workshop in the old schoolhouse, now repurposed as a community hub. 30 people came, from Mill Hollow, from neighboring towns, even a retired teacher from Virginia who'd uncovered similar corruption in her county decades ago. They shared tactics: how to file open records requests, how to document suspicious activity, how to build anonymous reporting networks without fear. No jargon. No ideology, just practical tools passed hand to hand like seeds. Whiskey, now graying around the muzzle, dozed by the wood stove as Arden wrote notes on a chalkboard. She no longer felt alone. The weight hadn't disappeared, but it had been shared. And in sharing, it had become lighter. In May, the state attorney general announced a full audit of all property seizures in Harlan County over the past 20 years. Dozens of deeds were returned. Fines were levied. 2 former deputies, including Langley, cut plea deals in exchange for testimony about a wider network of collusion that reached into the state capitol. Crow, now serving a 22-year sentence in a federal facility, had stopped writing letters. Arden visited her mother's grave that Memorial Day. She placed a single dogwood blossom on the headstone and sat quietly for a long time. She didn't speak aloud, but in her heart, she said what she'd been too afraid to say for years: "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." But she also said, "I see it now. And I won't look away again." Back in town, preparations were underway for the first annual Truth and Trust Festival. A reimagining of the old Corn Festival, but centered on civic engagement, local art, and storytelling. There would be booths on voter registration, land rights workshops, live music, and a reading tent where elders and children alike could share stories of Mill Hollow, past, present, and hoped for future. Arden stood on the porch of her shop one warm June evening, watching fireflies rise like tiny lanterns over the fields. The air smelled of rain and fresh-cut grass. Inside, her latest draft of the book lay open on the table, marked with edits in blue ink. The final chapter didn't end with Crow's conviction. It ended with a question: now that you know, what will you protect? She didn't have all the answers. But she knew this: truth wasn't a destination. It was a practice. A daily choice to look closer, to listen deeper, to refuse the comfort of convenient lies, even when they come from someone you once called sir. Mill Hollow would never be perfect. But it was honest now. And honesty, however painful, was the only soil in which real trust could grow. As the last light faded, Arden turned on the shop's porch lamp, a small, steady glow against the gathering dark. Somewhere down the road, a child laughed. A dog barked. And the creek, clear and sure, kept flowing. By late summer, the Truth and Trust Festival had become more than an event. It had become a rhythm the town leaned into, like the turning of seasons. Children painted murals on the boarded-up storefronts downtown, their brushes depicting doves carrying deeds and hands planting trees over cracked badges. Local musicians composed songs not about lost love or highway dreams, but about Lenore Pike's courage, Boyd's return, and the quiet woman who found a badge in the mud and refused to look away. Arden never asked for her name in the lyrics. She preferred to be the space between the notes, the silence that made the truth louder. The book, finally published in early September, arrived in plain brown paper. Arden opened the first copy on her porch at dawn, whiskey at her feet, steam curling from her coffee mug. The dedication read simply, "For those who look down." She ran her fingers over the words, then placed the book on the shelf beside her mother's old Bible, not as a replacement but as an addition. A new kind of scripture for a town learning to read its own story again. Copies sold steadily, not in bursts of viral fame but in slow, steady ripples. Librarians in West Virginia ordered boxes for their county reading groups. Professors in sociology departments assigned chapters. A retired postal worker in Tennessee wrote to say he'd recognized the same patterns in his own hometown decades ago, and now at 82 he was gathering neighbors to demand transparency in land records. Arden answered every letter. Not with grand promises but with resources, contacts, and one consistent message: start where you are. Tell your truth. You're not alone. In October, the Regional Watchdog Coalition held its first summit in a community center in Hazard. Arden drove down with Boyd and Tamsin, their car packed with printed guides on public records law and templates for anonymous tip lines. The room filled with faces, some weary, some angry, all determined. A woman from Letcher County spoke through tears about losing her family's farm after her brother questioned a sheriff's land appraisal. A young man from Pike County described how deputies shut down his podcast after he reported on missing evidence in a local murder case. Arden didn't offer solutions. She offered structure. Corruption thrives in isolation, she said, standing at the front of the room, voice calm but firm. But accountability grows in community. You don't need a spotlight. You need each other. By the end of the weekend, 3 new local chapters had formed. They called themselves the Creek Network, a nod to how truth, like water, always finds a way to surface if you give it space. Back in Mill Hollow, the land trust had grown to protect over 200 acres. Volunteers marked boundaries with engraved stones, not fences. Land belongs to the people, Tamsin explained during a town meeting, not to the highest bidder with a badge. Miriam Colby implemented a body camera policy that went beyond state requirements. Footage automatically archived, accessible to civilian review boards within 72 hours. She also hired 2 new deputies, one a former school counselor, the other a Navajo veteran who specialized in de-escalation. "We don't need enforcers," Miriam told the council. "We need neighbors in uniform." Arden began hosting monthly story nights at Vale and Vine. No agenda, no speeches, just people sharing memories, good and hard, over pie and weak tea. One night, old Mrs. Gable confessed she'd once believed Crow was protecting them from outside trouble. Another evening, a teenager spoke about how his grandfather had been pressured into signing away mineral rights, and how he'd just helped him file a claim for restitution. The room didn't erupt in outrage. It filled with quiet nods, murmurs of support, the soft clink of spoons against ceramic. Healing, Arden realized, wasn't dramatic. It was this: showing up, listening, remembering together. In December, a package arrived from Frankfurt. Inside was a formal notice. Arden's mother's case had been reclassified as a suspicious death under investigation. Not homicide, not yet, but a door left open. The new medical examiner had found traces of a rare sedative in retained tissue samples, one commonly used in veterinary procedures, and one Crow had access to through his side business boarding hunting dogs. Arden sat with the letter for hours, the weight of it both crushing and clarifying. She didn't cry. She filed it in the archive, labeled ongoing. She also planted another dogwood, this one at the edge of her mother's garden. "So you can watch over both of us," she whispered. Winter deepened. Snow fell in thick, silent blankets. The festival planning began again, bigger this year, invitations sent to towns across the state. But Arden knew the real work wasn't in gatherings. It was in the daily choice to question, to verify, to care enough to notice when something feels off. One icy morning in February, a state representative visited Mill Hollow, not for a photo op, but to study the land trust model. He sat in Arden's shop for 2 hours, drinking bitter coffee, asking detailed questions about governance and community buy-in. "This could be a blueprint," he said as he left. "For the whole region." Arden just nodded. "Just don't call it the Arden model. Call it what it is, people protecting home." Whiskey died 2 weeks later, not suddenly but gently, curled at her feet as the sun rose over the hills. Arden buried him beneath the first dogwood tree, placing his collar in the earth beside him. A collar once stained with threat, now laid to rest in peace. She didn't get another dog right away. But she did start mentoring a quiet girl named Elira, whose family had moved to Mill Hollow after losing their home to a similar scheme up north. Elira loved stories. She'd sit in the shop's window seat for hours, reading old newspapers, asking questions, taking notes in a journal with a fox on the cover. "Do you think it'll ever happen again?" Elira asked one afternoon watching snow fall. Arden looked out at the creek, now frozen but still moving beneath the ice. "Maybe," she said. "But now we know the signs. And we know how to fight, not with anger but with paper, with testimony, with each other." That was the real legacy. Not the trial, not the book, but the knowing. The refusal to let power go unquestioned simply because it wears a familiar face. By spring, the Creek network had expanded to 7 counties. Arden traveled less, trained more locals to lead. She wrote a second book, not about corruption but about repair. About how communities stitched themselves back together after betrayal. And every morning without fail, she opened Veil and Vine, lit the stove, put on a pot of coffee and waited, not for customers, but for truth to walk through the door as it always did, one quiet voice at a time. Because in the end, the sheriff was never the point. The point was the people who dared to look past the badge, and found their own courage staring back. 5 years after the badge was pulled from the mud, Mill Hollow no longer made headlines, but it thrived in ways headlines could never capture. The town hadn't grown larger, but it had grown deeper. Roots took hold where rot once spread. Arden, now in her mid-30s, wore fewer restless nights and more quiet mornings, her hands calloused not just from handling antiques, but from planting trees, stacking firewood, and turning the pages of grant proposals for the Creek network. She still lived above Veil and Vine, but the shop now shared its walls with a small research library, shelves lined with land deeds, public records, and oral history transcripts, all cataloged by Elira, who at 19 had become the youngest member of the state's newly formed Rural Justice Fellowship. The fellowship, born from Clara Madson's reporting and Arden's quiet persistence, trained young people from Appalachia to navigate legal systems, document abuses, and advocate for policy change without leaving their communities. "You don't have to flee to fight," Arden told the first cohort during their orientation under the dogwood trees. "Sometimes the bravest thing is to stay, and build something better where you are." Mill Hollow became a pilot site. Students came from Tennessee, Ohio, even as far as northern Alabama, not to study poverty or resilience as an abstract concept, but to learn how ordinary people, armed with nothing but notebooks and stubborn hope, could shift the balance of power. They stayed with local families, worked in gardens, attended town meetings, and listened, really listened, to stories that had been dismissed for generations as just how things are. And things weren't just how they were anymore. The old quarry, once a dumping ground for secrets, had been reclaimed. Volunteers cleared debris, tested the soil, and planted native wildflowers. A walking trail now wound through it, marked with plaques bearing quotes from Lenore Pike, Boyd Reeves, and even anonymous notes from townspeople who'd once stayed silent. "I wish I'd spoken sooner. I'm learning to trust again. Truth is heavy, but silence is heavier." Every spring, on the anniversary of the badge's discovery, the town held a quiet ceremony at Blackwater Creek. No speeches, no fanfare. Just people standing together for a moment of silence, then scattering wildflower seeds into the current. It was their way of saying, "We remember. We remain." Arden rarely spoke at these gatherings. She preferred to stand at the edge, Whiskey's replacement, a scruffy border collie mix named Cedar, nudging her hand for attention. She'd watch Tamsin hand out seed packets to children, Boyd help Miriam set up benches, and Alira guide visiting students through the archive with the calm authority of someone who'd learned early that knowledge is power only when shared. The book had gone into its third printing. Not bestseller status, but steady, passed hand to hand like a secret weapon. A judge in eastern Kentucky later admitted during a sentencing hearing that reading it had changed how she reviewed property forfeiture cases. A law school in Louisville added it to its ethics curriculum. Arden never sought recognition, but she accepted it when it served the work. She spoke at conferences, yes, but always insisted on bringing someone from Mill Hollow with her. "This isn't my story alone," she'd say. "It belongs to everyone who chose to see clearly." In the summer of the 5th year, the state legislature passed the Hollow Creek Act, a landmark bill requiring independent review of all civil asset forfeitures in rural counties, mandating transparency in land appraisals, and creating a whistleblower protection fund specifically for local government employees. It wasn't perfect. Lobbyists had watered it down. But it was a start. And it bore the fingerprints of dozens of quiet conversations in diners, church basements, and Arden's porch. That same summer, Arden received a letter from the warden of the federal prison where Elias Crow was serving his sentence. He'd requested a visit. She almost threw the letter away. But after a long walk with Cedar along the creek, she changed her mind. Not for him. For herself. She drove to the facility on a gray August morning. The visitation room was sterile, fluorescent, smelling faintly of bleach and old coffee. Crow looked older than his years, frail, hollow-cheeked, his uniform hanging loose on his frame. He didn't apologize. He didn't confess. He just said, "I thought I was saving this town. I thought order mattered more than fairness." Arden sat across from him, hands folded, voice steady. "Order without justice isn't order. It's control. And control always breaks." He nodded once as if he finally understood. Or maybe he was just tired. She left without saying goodbye. Back in Mill Hollow, she didn't speak of the visit. But that night, she added a new entry to the archive. Not about Crow, but about power. About how even those who abuse it are often trapped by their own fear of chaos, their belief that people can't be trusted to govern themselves. "The real work," she wrote, "is proving them wrong, not with force but with community." Fall arrived with golden light and crisp air. The Truth and Trust Festival drew its largest crowd yet, over 500 people from 12 counties. This year they unveiled a permanent mural on the side of the old post office. A winding creek flowing through generations of faces, young, old, black, white, native, immigrant, all holding books, tools, seedlings, and open hands. At the center, barely visible unless you looked closely, was a small, tarnished badge sinking into the earth, overgrown with dogwood roots. Arden stood back as children ran their fingers over the painted bark. She felt no triumph, only peace. The story wasn't over. Corruption didn't vanish with one conviction, but the soil had changed. And from changed soil, new things grew. Alira approached her, holding a thick envelope. "The fellowship just got federal funding," she said, eyes bright. "They want us to expand to 3 more states." Arden smiled. "Then we'd better start training more archivists." She walked home as dusk settled, Cedar trotting ahead, nose to the ground. Fireflies blinked in the fields. Somewhere, a fiddle played softly on a porch. The creek murmured its endless song, clear, constant, unafraid. Arden unlocked the door to Vale and Vine, turned on the lights and opened the ledger to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote, "What we protect today, someone else will inherit tomorrow." And then she began to write. But peace in Mill Hollow, Arden would later realize, had been built on the assumption that evil only wears one face, and that once unmasked, it stays buried. It was on a still October night, 2 weeks after the festival, that the first sign returned. Cedar growled low in his throat, hackles raised, staring at the tree line behind the shop. Not at a raccoon. Not at the wind. At something standing just beyond the reach of the porch light. Arden saw nothing, but the next morning, tucked beneath the dogwood's lowest branch, was a small, mud-caked object. A deputy's badge. Number 23. One they'd never accounted for. She reported it to Miriam immediately. The investigation turned up nothing. No footprints, no fingerprints, no records of who'd worn that number. It was as if the badge had materialized from thin air, or from someone who knew how to vanish. Then came the whispers. Not in town, no one dared speak openly, but in the silence between phone calls and the way Tamsin's voice tightened when she said, "My files were moved," or how Boyd found his shop's security camera feed looped on a 3-hour delay. Elira stopped sleeping, claiming she heard soft knocking on the archive's back door at exactly 3:17 a.m., the same time Arden's mother had died. The final warning arrived in late November. Not a letter this time. A photograph, slipped under Vale and Vine's door during the night. It showed Arden walking Cedar by the creek, taken from the ridge above. On the back, in handwriting eerily similar to Crow's, but not quite the same, was a single line: "Badges can be retired. Truth can't." Arden's blood ran cold. Crow was still in prison. She checked the registry that morning. But someone else had studied his methods. Someone who knew how the town thought, how it healed, how it trusted again. Someone who understood that the most effective way to break a place isn't with violence, but with the slow, chilling return of doubt. She stood at her window that night, Cedar pressed against her leg, staring into the dark woods. The creek flowed as it always had, calm on the surface, hiding everything beneath. And for the first time in years, Arden felt it again. That old, gnawing sense that eyes were watching from the shadows, not to protect but to wait. Because power doesn't die when one man falls. It just finds a new hand to wear the badge. And in the quietest towns, where trust runs deep and secrets run deeper, the most terrifying truth isn't that the sheriff betrayed you. It's that the next one already has.